Tim, welcome to Monero Magazine, man. It's good to have you on.
Thank you for having me over. This should be interesting.
So, I want to get started with some easy stuff and the stuff that everyone wants, I suppose. Everyone wants to know the simple stuff first and really quickly. So, what do you need to get started? Like, what are the printers you need? What are the materials you need? And probably more importantly, what's the knowledge and attitudes that you need to get into 3D printing as a whole?
I mean, a big part of it is understanding what you want to do and like what your end goal is. So, in the space I work in, which is 3D printed firearms, you have to make sure you have access to the parts you need. A lot of designs use parts kits and such. Not all designs do. There's like the FGC9 is probably the best example of a firearm which can be sourced with um, much less conventional components, which are much easier to find in a lot of places. So you need to understand what you want to do. And then there's a lot of good 3D printers out there. Like the Bamboo Lab printer is a really low cost, incredible printer that's come out recently. And that it's a very accessible option that has the performance that very expensive printers have had for the last decade. So extremely accessible. And like the Ender 3s has been a really popular option up until even now. It's still really popular. And those are under $200. And those are functional printers for making a lot of different parts. And then filament is widely available because of the popularity of 3D printing. Filament, like PLA plus filaments and carbon fiber nylons, are available now from a ton of different manufacturers all across the world. Really easy to find. So finding the printers and the filaments is not really actually a big problem. It's a few $100s, and if you spend a little bit more money, it's plug and play, ready to go. As far as knowledge, that really just takes some time experimenting with your printer, fixing the mistakes you get just to learn a little bit. And then there's nothing really super advanced. You don't have to have any design skills if you're using off the shelf designs, if you want to use that term. Like some of the designs I do and designs that other developers use, it's basically downloading the files and then reading the documentation, using that base knowledge that you've gained just by messing around and playing with your printer, and then printing the component out. So there's definitely knowledge that comes from different locations, and it will be a really interesting project, which we've been tossing around for a little while, trying to create a more centralized, easy to access information area that kind of has everything in one place. Right now, information is kind of spread out, but in a nutshell, it's the hardware side of things is very basic, and the knowledge side of things can be learned pretty quickly just by doing.
And what about the parts that you can't print? How would you source those?
Yeah, that's where things get more challenging. So like everything I do is based on the AR-15 platform. And in all practicality, that is basically United States only, unless you have some source of something in another country. With components that are designed for European areas or areas that don't have access to nearly as many firearms components, things like the FGC9 are designed to use a lot more hardware store type parts, and parts that are sourced on places like Alibaba that are not firearm specific. So tool parts or the appropriate types of like hydraulic line or something along those lines, more industrial type components, which can be used in firearms. And Alibaba and other Chinese suppliers like that are popular places to find it.
So, what exact parts are needed that you can't print yourself? I think the barrel's one. What else is there?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you really want to break it down very generic, you have the barrel and you have the bolt. Those are the two components which really can't be printed. They can actually, and there are people who are, I believe, if you've heard of Suckboy Tony and some of the work he's done with his plasma pump rifle. So he does have metal components, but his barrel is a metal sleeve, but internal to that is a 3D printed sleeve, which has the rifling in it. And he's actually using that successfully with a electric ignition system. So there's no primers. He's able to use black powder or smokeless powder, and able to fire quite a number of rounds, like many dozen. I think he's got like 80 to 100 rounds. I mean, with a lot of plastic parts. So it is totally possible. I think as time goes on, there's going to be more options for that as solutions to preventing damage with plastic come along. But it's already being done now. But for the majority of firearms, especially anything that uses more traditional, just brass cartridges, the barrel and the bolt, which seals against the barrel, against the breech face, both of those parts need to be made from metal. And then other than that, springs, things like the firing pin, those parts need to be metal. And but the barrel and the bolt make up the kind of the heart of the firearm, the core of the firearm. That those parts are the ones that are normally the hardest to manufacture.
It's probably gone into a different skill, but you could probably machine those parts. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you're machining is a lot bigger step than 3D printing as far as the equipment needed and the skills needed. However, if someone who has that equipment and skills, yeah, I mean, those parts have been machined by home firearm manufacturers at this point for probably hundreds of years, but at least 100.
And talking about CAD, I assume you use CAD. Is that correct? Firstly,
Yeah, absolutely.
so what are some? Because I know AutoCAD is pretty expensive. We used to use it in school, and I remember like looking at the price the other day. I think it was what like $1,000 a month or something ridiculous like that. What are some good alternatives for people to use CAD that don't have to pay $1,000 a month?
So that's actually the biggest kind of problem in the open hardware or trying to design your own parts. Like for firearms, really for anything. The CAD software is kind of the weak link here. I use SolidWorks, and it's Dassault. Dassault owns SolidWorks. It's a CAD system, and that's what I use. The license is around $4,000, so it's expensive. And you can also get like a monthly or yearly option, but it's also very expensive. The open source CAD available right now, there aren't any good options. I've looked at a few of them. Most of them can be pretty much dismissed. Though there are some people who can do amazing things with the extremely basic CAD, like Tinkercad, for an example. You're probably familiar with Tinkercad, right?
I'm not, but continue.
Okay. Well, probably a lot of the viewers are. I mean, if you look up Tinkercad, it's I don't know who makes it actually. It's a Google product, but it's an open source project. It's free, and it's extremely limited in what you can do. It's very time consuming to use. People actually do some pretty interesting stuff with it, but I highly do not recommend that, and it is not practical for doing more advanced designs. So I use SolidWorks currently. As far as lower cost options, there is a very similar program. It's Solid Edge, and it is once again not open source. It's very, very expensive. However, they have a non-commercial version available for free that is fully featured. And that's Solid Edge, and it's based off of the same kernel as SolidWorks. If that's the right term. It's the same base program, which goes back at this point 50 years. So it's a pretty buggy mess, but that's what SolidWorks and Solid Edge are based off of. They're both very capable programs, but Solid Edge does have a free version available, but it is not open source, and they could pull that at any time and pull the licenses. So CAD is a really big weak spot right now in the open source kind of hardware community. And Fusion 360 is the one other option I didn't mention. It's not free, but it's not that much money. It's a monthly subscription, and it's at $80 a month, something in that range, I'm pretty sure.
What are the best resources for people to, I suppose, up their 3D printing or firearm skills, whether that's, learning about printing itself or learning about CAD or whatever, whether that's videos or books or whatever?
So resources, and I mentioned that earlier about centralizing resources and trying to create a platform which has a lot of the information in one place. Right now, you have, if you're just someone getting into it, not doing design work, you have two different aspects. You have the 3D printing side, which is a huge area. There's a ton of people doing it. Then you have the firearm side. It's also a huge area. A lot of people doing it. And those two areas kind of meet in the middle. And there's that little area in there, which is 3D printed guns, where you're working with firearms and 3D printing. So the best thing to do right now is to find resources on 3D printing. And there's a lot of really good YouTube channels out there. CNC Kitchen does a lot of really informative videos. There's 3D Print General does a lot, and then there's all the big guys. There's a lot of really good resources on 3D printing, like just on YouTube alone. Not to mention elsewhere on the internet. And then firearm stuff can normally be found relatively easily online, less on YouTube, unfortunately, nowadays. But there's a lot of good articles and sites and stuff that cover different parts of how more conventional firearms like ARs work. If you're doing something that's not conventional, like an AR, FGC9, those platforms tend to have really good documentation, which the FGC9 in particular does. Not all, but the FGC9 has really good documentation. So you kind of have to hunt and peck for that information in each category. And that's something I think would be really nice to work on, is getting that into a more consolidated form where someone can learn it all more quickly and easily.
Um, so I think it's important to probably talk about the legality of 3D printing firearms. Presumably, you're a pretty open public guy. Presumably,
Mm-hmm.
it's legal or legal enough where you're doing it. But what's the depth of your knowledge in regards to the legality of it? So within the USA, within specific states, and even within other countries as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not, I'm well, not obviously, but I'm not a lawyer. So I am not particularly, up to date on everything, but I do follow the laws and regulations that get passed, and the different lawsuits, and everything we have in the courts here, which is very dynamic, actually, changing a lot. Under federal law here in the U.S., we don't have any restrictions on making your own firearms. So under federal law, I can 3D print as many firearms as I want, as long as they don't fall under the National Firearms Act, which applies to all firearms, homemade or otherwise, and that is machine guns, silencers, short-barreled rifles, anything over 50 caliber, dangerous devices, and it's and other items as well. But it's any other weapon, which is something that falls outside of the typical definitions. But as long as you stay away from that, you're doing more conventional firearms. It's completely legal. Now you can't make firearms and then try to sell them for business purposes. And that kind of gets into a possible gray area because we've had recent rulings that are trying to make it even more restrictive. But currently, as long as you don't transfer the firearm to anybody else, it is perfectly legal. And that's under federal law. Under state law, it varies a lot. I'm in Tennessee, which is a relatively good state as far as firearms laws go. And we don't have any regulations on making our own firearms. So I can make them under state law. It's all completely legal. However, many states like California on the west coast of the U.S., they have for a while had a lot of registration requirements. You have to have a block of metal installed in your homemade firearm to make it legal. But until very recently, I believe earlier this year, there's been more laws passed making it completely illegal. It's not impossible to do there. And then there's quite a few states in the Northeast, as well as on the West Coast. And really, I believe Illinois, they have a lot of regulations on firearms in general. They have assault weapon bans and the like, which make getting any firearm difficult. And then they have particular laws targeting ghost guns, as they like to call them. Just what it is, it's a personally made, it's not just a homemade firearm, something people have done for a really long time. And it's not any more dangerous than a normal gun. But normal as in serialized. But yeah, it varies a lot by state. Right now, I would say the majority of the U.S., the U.S. states do not regulate it, and it's perfectly legal. But there are definitely states that stick out that try to make it more difficult.
So I want to move over to questions about the firearm you've designed called the Orca. So I want to know how you actually came up with the design for the Orca and what was the logic behind the design itself.
Yeah, that's another good question. So the Orca is what I call a fully printed AR. It's obviously not fully printed. It's simply printing as many of the components as we can. So normally, the one of the big motivations behind 3D printed firearms is to make it more private and accessible. So if you want to buy a firearm off the shelf in the U.S., you have to go through a FFL. You have to get a background check. It's the form 4473, and it's an intrusive process. And there isn't supposed to be a registry, but there is a bit of a backdoor registry in the US right now. So a lot of people don't like that. So the original motivation was similar to 80% lowers, if you've heard of those. And it is to make your own firearm, which is legal, but it's not on the books. It's not put on a registry, so it's more private. People don't know you have it. And that's something a lot of people, especially in the United States, are concerned about. Also, if firearms are banned, like if you're in Europe or something like that, and you need one, it makes it more accessible. That's kind of the original motivation. In the US, what that means is printing the receiver of the firearm. So on an AR-15, that's the lower receiver. And that's what I started designing. That's what I've actually been working on all day today, is working my latest design for that. But that component is considered the legal firearm. The rest of the parts can be bought off the shelf, shipped to your house. So the lower receiver is a really big focus. However, I wanted to try to expand that scope a little bit, really as a learning process, number one. And number two, I wanted to try to take the AR-15 and improve on it ergonomically, visually, and make it into kind of just a more improved, visually appealing, and ergonomic firearm. So that was the big goal behind the Orca. There isn't really a practical reason for it. right now, at least, because the components aren't regulated. So there isn't a regulatory reason to do it. And you can buy an upper receiver for a similar amount of money. There's a little bit of cost savings if you use a PLA plastic and you buy cheap parts for it, but it's not that big. So the Orca is more of a design study and a really cool project. So that's kind of why I went about it. And that was the motivations.
So how much would it cost to make one, including buying the barrels and the filaments, etc.?
Anywhere really from probably $300 to $600, depending what parts you get. Like I sell parts kits. That's my business side of things. Is I sell parts kits for my designs. And if you buy my parts kits, it's definitely more expensive. I have nicer parts. But if you go and you shop around for really cheap parts, which you can get, there's a couple manufacturers who make some very cheap, albeit lower quality, poor quality control and all of that. But you can do one for around 300, not including the cost of your equipment like your 3D printer and a laptop and all of that stuff.
So just again, like a bit of a legal question. I know you're not a lawyer, but say for example you sell, I don't know if you do, but say for example you sell a barrel on your website. What's the legality technically if you were to ship that somewhere between a metal pipe and a firearms barrel?
As far as like where it falls in legally?
Yeah, so just throw out an example. If I was to import one to Australia, and I know you're not an expert on Australian law, but how would they know it's not a metal pipe, so to say?
So that is a good question, and one I don't have an exact answer for. What I know best is I don't ship out of the country, and other manufacturers don't, because the U.S. has the ITAR. It's the ITAR. It's a trade in something international trade in arms restrictions. It's basically a restriction on shipping weapons and weapons accessories and stuff out of the U.S. And I think it's overly restrictive and not at all needed, but we have it. So there's a lot of restrictions on shipping weapons components out of the United States. And I don't know if that exactly applies to barrels. I'm pretty confident it does. It applies to a lot of other components like magazines, night vision, stuff like that. So that keeps us from shipping most firearms parts outside of the U.S. So that kind of is what's keeping stuff in the U.S. As far as Canadian, yes, Canadian, but also Australian laws, they really probably couldn't tell the difference. If you just ship some generic components, you're not going to know unless you have someone who really knows what they're doing and has handled these parts on a regular basis, who is checking X-rays or whatever they do. I don't know if they even do that. They wouldn't be able to pick it up. It's really just the U.S. ITAR laws keeps us from shipping it out of this country.
So how long were you designing the Orca for from when you go day one to a fully tried and tested product?
So I think it was about 9 months, and that wasn't all continuous, but it took probably about 5 months to get it 90% of the way, and then it took another 4 months to work all the bugs out and actually get it into a release ready item, which we could release to the internet for people to download and print without having to worry about a lot of problems.
And what's the quality of the print itself? Like, can it be considered on par or near on par with mass-produced rifles?
Actually, yes. As far as reliability and function, it's very, very close. Even in strength, it's quite durable. The limitations compared to a more traditional machined aluminum upper receiver, and the upper receiver is the limiting part of a firearm. Like the a AR-15 has an upper receiver and a lower receiver, as we talked about earlier. A polymer 3D printed lower receiver on a conventional metal upper is just as good as a factory firearm. It lasts just as long. It's all the wear components and everything is in the upper. That's where your heat is. That's where your pressure is. On the Orca, the upper is 3D printed. So the big limitations that you get over a factory firearm are related to heat and accuracy. So the Orca has significantly lower accuracy than most factory firearms. It's like 6 MOA, which limits its practical range to around 100 yards or 100 meters if you're in Australia. But that is the first limitation, is accuracy. And the second one is heat. So if you print it from a low cost, like PLA based filament, you're only going to be able to put a couple magazines through it before your accuracy starts degrading because it starts getting soft. And then after 5 or 6 magazines, it'll actually stop functioning because the parts will get so soft, your barrel will shift forward. won't be able to go into battery and it'll just stop functioning, which actually happened to us when we were filming one of the videos. I was filming a video with Print Shoot Repeat, if you've heard of him. And we actually overheated the PLA Orca and it stopped functioning. If you print it from a more expensive filament like a carbon fiber nylon, which has a much higher heat resistance, I actually have not had them overheat yet, but you can get a lot more rounds through it, more rounds than you would ordinarily ever shoot. So you start getting much closer to factory rifles, but the accuracy issues still remain. So other than that, it's actually a very reliable, practical firearm.
So I know in a lot of modern firearms, I don't know what the exact material is, but they're a plastic-like material on the modern firearms. So why you're not able to use those materials, for example?
Yeah, so there actually aren't that many firearms that use plastic for components that are affecting the weapon's accuracy or resistance to heat. Like a Glock, for an example, might be something you're thinking of. And a Glock, the lower receiver, the frame on the pistol is made from a injection molded nylon blend, and it is does not affect the firearm's accuracy and does not affect the ability to handle heat of the firearm. So it can be made from plastic quite easily. Just like with AR-15s, there are several companies who make injection molded plastic lower receivers, but the upper receivers are still metal. So the plastic used on firearms normally is not used as extensively as we use it on the Orca. Second to that is that 3D printing, because of the way the process works, building up little lines of plastic at a time, it's not a homogeneous part. So you get problems with layer adhesion, and that limits the part's durability and strength. So you have to design around that to build a part that is strong enough, which is totally doable, and that's what I do. But that's a limitation you don't have structurally with injection molded parts, which is what they use on more conventional firearms.
And I know on the Orca as well, you use hose clamps to keep the separate parts of the firearms together. What's the logic behind that? Like, surely there's a better design than using hose clamps.
Yeah, so actually right now there isn't, believe it or not. The hose clamps originated on my lower receivers, and that's around the buffer tower. I mentioned the layer adhesion issue. So on ARs, you have a buffer tower, which a buffer tube screws into, and that's where your pin, your spring and mass cycle back and forth to cycle the weapon. And that's has quite a lot of stress on it when you're shouldering it and when you're firing the weapon. And I put the buffer band, which is a hose clamp, around the buffer tower to clamp it all together. On the AR-15 lower receivers, there is a better solution. I've already have prototypes and I'm working the design now. That'll be released with my next lower design. It's quite simple. It'll be more streamlined and function great. On the Orca, on the other hand, due to the geometry of it, the hose clamps are right now and will continue to be the best option. And it's the only downside of the hose clamps is the fact that they have that little worm drive screw on them, which is not perfectly streamlined. There's a lot of stigma against them because they're garden variety, but I've actually never had a hose clamp fail on a firearm. You can over torque them and break them because of that, but a properly installed hose clamp has never failed on any of my firearms, and I've never gotten a single report in the last 3 years I've been doing this of any failure. So I think they're extremely solid and just the pinnacle of 21st century technology.
What's your previous experience? Obviously, you're very qualified at what you do at the moment. Do you have like a background in engineering or working with the firearms industry in general?
I don't. I always worked a little bit with firearms, but I really didn't get into it until I started doing 3D printed firearms. I just sort of jumped into it, and I had a tiny bit of CAD design experience designing some buildings and some other stuff, just some little sheds and things, mostly just for fun, but nothing at all remotely advanced. So I kind of learned it all starting back early in 2020 when I got my first 3D printer and started doing it. So I'm really, before that, I did a lot of stuff with like electronics and UAVs or model airplanes, stuff like that. So my camera, let me restart that. But yeah, as far as CAD design, I just kind of jumped into it and started learning it to do firearms and other related parts.
So what's your educational or professional background? Did you go to uni and study engineering?
Nope,
Just
I have
scratch?
just a high school, and that's it.
Okay, cool. I got to ask, why do you do this? Is it from a passion point of view? Is it a educational experiment? Is it an ideological thing?
Yeah, so a little bit of several of those. So it actually, Hoffman Tactical started as a business, and it still is. So it started as a money-making business, trying to get something going. I wanted to be self-employed, and that's how I got started. And I was doing things. When I started Hoffman Tactical, I wasn't even doing any 3D printing. I was doing textiles, actually, trying to sew some different waterproof covers and accessories for actually hearing protection, which didn't go anywhere. But that's how I got started. Then I got into it because I was interested in 3D printed firearms. I thought it would be just an interesting side project, and then it just started really taking off and building from there. I do it now because I think it's very important. It is a business. That is a big part of it as well. I do it professionally, and I really enjoy the work. I mean, obviously that's a bit of a misnomer. That's never really actually the case, but there are some really interesting things we can do that I look forward to working on. So I have other interests outside of 3D printed firearms that I like to pursue as well. But right now, this is kind of the thing which I have the most success with, and that's a big part of why I'm working on it.
So, have you thought about starting your own firearms company?
As far as selling, well, I already have. I mean, that's what Hoffman Tactical is. But as far as selling like completed firearms,
Yeah. So, like, again, I don't know how the whole process works, but essentially, mass-produced serialized firearms available for
yeah.
purchasing
So
around the country.
I've kind of just briefly thought about it, but I don't think I would, because it's not really, from like a philosophical standpoint, I don't like the idea. And also, I don't think that I would be able to compete. There's so many other companies cranking out guns, just mass producing them for low cost, that would not be easy to compete with. Something I would like to do is different firearms accessories, which I already kind of do to some degree, but I'd like to get into doing higher capacity magazine fitting devices, stuff like that. Just kind of cool side stuff. But as far as selling serialized firearms, I really don't think there's a point in doing it. I think 3D printing them is the way to go.
So, why do you say philosophically you don't agree? Is that because you don't agree with government regulations around registering, etc.?
Exactly. I don't agree with a lot of the regulations we have. So I just wouldn't want to add to that. Right now, I'm providing a more accessible option that actually works really well, and I think that that's what I want to pursue, rather than trying to get into a already extremely competitive market that has regulations I don't like anyway.
Have you had any job offers from companies, to throw a name out there, like Remington or Winchester or something like that?
No, I've had some small startup companies reach out to me related to body armor type stuff they're working on, or there's some more esoteric air gun related stuff. I've had some companies reach out, and but they've never really gone anywhere. Don't really have time to take another job. This is kind of my main thing. But as far as big companies, no. They should, though. I would be glad to help them improve some of their products. As far as the large companies go, they have a lot of problems. Absolutely.
Right. And I have a question. So, are you like, surely you're scared of blowing off one of your hands, especially when you're like testing a new firearm, for example?
No, actually. So if I was doing certain things, absolutely. But what I do right now, my released projects, it's all AR-15 related, and all of my firearms that I've done so far use a AR-15 bolt and an AR-15 barrel. Those are factory parts, same as any other AR-15. All of the pressure of the gas expanding and expelling the projectiles contained within those two components. So the plastic outside could fail, and I've had plenty of failures on prototypes, and they've never been bad because there's no high pressure, there's no actual explosion. It's just a mechanical failure due to the bolt cycling, spring tension, or something related to that. So no, blowing your hand off is something everyone should be, take caution, use common sense. But for what I do right now, it's never been a concern of mine.
So it would only be a real problem if you were to machine your own parts.
Yeah, basically. Or if you're doing something like the FGC9, which is a blowback 9mm, and out of battery explosions are definitely a problem if it's not done right. And it's actually remarkably safe, but it can definitely be a problem. So things like that, it can be more concerning. And I guess the one thing which I should mention is AR9s. And this is the one thing I have had where I haven't been worried about it really, but I have had some issues. Anything related to 9mm carbines that are blowback. Blowback basically means the gun doesn't lock up. There's no, on an AR-15, the bolt lugs lock and it's locked. It can't come out until it unlocks, and then it's got a rotating bolt. However, on a blowback AR-9, it's just a big heavy bolt that just presses against the barrel, the breech with a spring, and then the weight of the bolt is what delays it opening. And if you have too light of a bolt, it can open too fast, and then you'll get your shell case will rupture. And I've had that happen before, and it can be a little scary. You blow the bottom of the gun out basically, and that's the one thing I have had. However, your hands aren't there. It's not something that's going to look like a hand grenade under most circumstances, though. It's something that you should be cautious with.
So the Orca itself is from what I've seen, a fully automatic rifle. So where's the distinction between machine gun and fully automatic rifle?
So that is, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a bit of a misunderstood thing. The Orca is actually the same as every other AR-15. It's a semi-automatic rifle. If you wanted to, if you had the right paperwork and everything, you could convert it to full auto. That hasn't been done as far as I know. However, a couple of my prototypes have a device I've been working on for a little while. It's a active reset trigger. And it is a device that basically forces the trigger forward and then allows you to pull the trigger again much, much, much faster. So if you're careful and you follow the trigger, you can fire almost as fast as a machine gun. And that is what I have used in the Orca, and several of the videos, like the video with Print, Shoot, Repeat, I use that. And it's not a machine gun. The way the U.S. law is written, it's very, very specific. So the active reset trigger is not a machine gun. However, the ATF, which is the regulating agency in our country that works with the firearms laws on a federal level, they want to make it a machine gun. So there's definitely kind of a area there, which could be considered a gray area by some people. The law is very explicit. It's not gray. It's not a machine gun. But it's an area in the U.S. which there's been court cases over it and such. And as of now, it's not been settled out yet. And it's still, as far as I'm concerned, not a machine gun.
Wow, man. I love the culture in the US. I don't remember which state or exactly when it was, but I remember maybe 10 years ago, it could have even been California, like they wanted to ban these assault rifles, right? Mm-hmm. And then I can't remember again which manufacturer it was, but they came out with a design that was a pistol, but it had the whole AR-15 thing around it, right? So when you look at you break down the blueprint, there's literally just like a pistol on the inside, but the whole kit around it, like from the stock to the barrel to the magazine, is all just accessories on the pistol. So it's quite fun.
It's a pistol, like a pistol chassis. There's a number of those. Yeah, there's a lot of, the firearms industry is very dynamic, at least on a smaller level. There's a lot of small companies involved. That's what's interesting about the firearms industry compared to almost every other industry, is that it's a very, very small industry. We obviously have big players like Remington and Ruger and other large companies making firearms. However, there's also a lot of little companies that the owner runs the shop, that you have half a dozen employees working, and they make firearms components, and they actually have a place in the market. That's not totally insignificant. That's what's cool about it. And what's cool about those little companies is they're very dynamic, and they're very quick to adjust to regulatory changes and such. And that kind of thing is a part of a result of that. So that's definitely a nice part of the firearms industry, as opposed to working in some other industry like, aviation or something like that.
So here in Australia, the culture against firearms is pretty big. For example, if you advocate for more liberal firearms laws, it's as we've seen, the media comes after you like you just want to kill children and you're a domestic terrorist or whatever slur, right? Like just whatever garbage they want to throw at you. But what's the pushback in the USA like? So do you think it would actually be successful in implementing sort of like a national firearms ban, or to a certain level anyway?
As far as successful as the law standing up in court, or as far as reducing firearms crime?
As far as literally getting firearms out of America.
No. It's at this point, it's really too many people, a huge number of people are too much aware of the politics and what's going on to let that happen. People simply wouldn't comply with it. And it wouldn't hold up in the courts at all. What we're seeing right now in the U.S. is, especially in states, the state attempts to pass a law, and not everywhere, but in a lot of places, it immediately goes. We have several organizations that are well funded, and there's just so many grassroots type of people that are interested in preserving their ability to protect themselves, that the laws are very quickly turned down in the courts. So at this point, it's too late for them, I think, to attempt to do any kind of mass ban or anything. I mean, they could always try, but unless something culturally changes over the next couple decades, it would not work.
Yeah, and the culture thing is a big part of it, right? And that's what I think about here in Australia. Every time I think about how do we get more liberal firearms laws, it always comes back to the culture. So, how do you think we go about advancing a more liberal firearms culture?
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with views towards government, I think, and like what the role of government is. And I don't know exactly about Australia, but in a lot of countries, the government is very in control of a lot of stuff. It's really a very centralized statist. I like to use the word statist, which I think is very accurate. That where the state kind of controls everything. It's more of a lot of people in Europe and stuff are just used to a very statist environment. They think that's how it should be. And the only really way the restriction on firearms is kind of a microcosm of the larger problem with statism. And it's really needs to lean more towards focusing on individual responsibility and not relying on the government in the first place. That's kind of where the swing needs to take place. And that's a big thing. So that's really where the bigger picture is rather than just firearms.
What's your answer to the question, why do you need guns?
To keep the government in check. Absolutely.
Any other reasons?
Well, I mean, yeah, just personal defense is one. And there's a million different little uses, but the main one, at least here in the U.S., I think for many people, not all, but many, including myself, is to have a means of defending yourself if the government does decide to do something draconian. Something you might have seen, in the 1930s in Germany or something along those lines is why a lot of people want firearms in case something of that type happens, which looks very, very, very distant and something that would be very hard to happen. But if you study history, those kinds of horrible events perpetrated by governments are not that, they come up very quickly. So I think that's the number one reason, at least here in this country.
Yeah, so people over here is very much, they trust the government. So if you're, for example, I couldn't agree with you more. I think firearms are a very important part of civil liberty and keeping the government accountable. But over here where people just, I mean, there's probably 25% of people who don't, but I'd say a vast majority of people just inherently trust the government and inherently believe that people shouldn't have those powers and the government is the only people who should have those powers. So it's very hard to fight against on a large scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's the big challenge. I mean, it comes in a lot of aspects. Like in Australia, is homeschooling legal?
It's legal, yes.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that was a big cultural shift. Like in the U.S., we used to have compulsory school laws until in 1980s. It kind of phased out 70s, 80s, 90s in that time period. I think, and that's that's like a sign of the cultural shift. So I don't know, that's just an example. I thought maybe they would have, but government having control of the education system is a big problem. The trusting the government is really the where the shift happens. So in the U.S., as time goes on, nobody trusts the government because they're human as well. They're not a perfect computer system, which would also be bad, but they're human as well. They have all the human faults, and they're working for their best interest or for someone else's best interest who they think is going to help them. And it's a very corrupt system. Any large organization like that very quickly becomes corrupt. And unfortunately, up until now in history, all of the checks and balances you try to implement to keep corruption from growing always seems to fail after a certain amount of time. And that's why distrusting the government is important, because they are very much not in your best interest, because it's not one cohesive, benevolent entity. It's a broken entity of millions of people, at least in the US, who are all trying to do different things. And there's absolutely no reason to have any trust there. So the trust in government that they're there to help is really the number one issue.
Tim, thanks so much for coming on, man. You're a great guy. You shared some awesome knowledge, and I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. It's been good.